encouraging economic development, the exploitation of its resources. But what ended up happening was a century of chaos, a century of fits and starts, of economic chaos, of pegging its currency, of unpegging its currency, of being connected to the gold standard, of disconnecting from the gold standard. All of these measures and these institutions that Dave was talking about last week. So Argentina couldn't make up its mind, or we in or we out, right? And as a result, it created a hell of a lot of instability. Now, this is a gross oversimplification of Argentinian history, but the point is just that this confluence of all sorts of domestic politics, international politics, this role of these international institutions, and when Argentina wasn't able to fully buy in, it created a lot of chaos for that country, and it fundamentally undermined their well-being. And so here we can see consumer prices. And so they went through massive inflation over time, right? In the late 80s. Now recently it's been quite stable because they actually pegged their dollar to the US dollar. So it was, the Argentinian peso was pegged to the dollar, and so inflation wasn't able to wreak havoc on the economy in the way that it used to. But inflation was a huge problem. Imagine waking up in 1986 and some tortillas being $2, and then 2 years later they're $2,000. Right? And that's essentially what Argentina's gone through. That's what Venezuela's going through right now. That's what Zimbabwe went through in the 1990s and the early 2000s. This is what we would call hyperinflation. Right? And so this is when individual leaders of countries decide, I don't need to play this international game. I don't need to integrate with these economic institutions. I'm not going to listen to what the IMF and the World Bank are telling me what to do. I'm going to make policy on my own. Tends to create chaos. So someone asked, well, I believe someone asked last week, well, what happens when a country goes bankrupt? Or can a country go bankrupt? And how does that work? Well, Argentina is basically the world's greatest example of a country going bankrupt. And it has gone bankrupt how many times? 4 times since 1980. Defaulted on its own currency, essentially said, I can no longer pay my debts. And the people of Argentina have suffered as a result of this. The country is worse off. And so I want to sort of embody that in a graph from our very first lecture, which was here was the calories available per individual global basis 1961. And let's look at the shade of blue that Argentina is. So they were getting somewhere, what, 2,800 to 2,800 to 3,000 kilocalories a day of food availability for people in Argentina. So now we can see most of the world is red at this stage, but when we jump into the future, most of the world has improved quite a bit, right? That's a nice change in color. But what does Argentina do? One of the very few countries in Latin America, one of the very few countries in the world where the availability of food actually declined between 1961 and what's the date on this one? 2009. That's shocking, right? And I think that is directly connected to their inability to do as the Europeans and to meaningfully integrate into a global economic system. Their inability to leverage their natural capital and their resources. Their inability to listen to the policy guidance of economic institutions and do something about it. So for me, that's kind of nifty. And here's one final comparison. Looking at Argentina between 1900 and 1929, and looking at Argentina between 1929 and 1980. And so you can see that this is a ratio of Argentina's success to Australia, Brazil, Canada, and the United States. So in the early 20th century, Argentina had more people than Canada, had more income than Canada, and had more per capita income than Canada. So it was a richer country than we were. But by the 1980s,